The wind blew across the desert plain, carrying with it a whisper of dust and the faint scent of rain that never seemed to come. The sun had dipped low behind the red rocks, spilling its last light across the canyon like blood. A lone woman stumbled through the wasteland, her torn dress clinging to her legs, her boots heavy with sand. Her breath came out ragged, but she didn't stop. Not yet. Death would find her soon enough. For now she wanted to face it on her own terms, away from the men who had taken everything from her. Her name was Clara. She had once been the wife of a rancher, a man who dreamed of building a life out west, where the land stretched farther than the eye could see. Together, they had come to the Arizona territory chasing hope. But hope was a fragile thing in a land ruled by hunger, heat, and gunfire. Her husband had died trying to protect their small homestead from raiders who wanted their horses and their supplies. She had buried him under the lone cottonwood tree by the river, before she burned the house to the ground. After that, there was nothing left for her. No home, no reason to keep walking, no reason to keep breathing. She had been wandering for 2 days without water when the horizon began to swim in front of her eyes. She thought she saw movement among the rocks, shadows gliding silently like ghosts. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the figures didn't disappear. Then came the sound, the low rhythmic thud of hooves echoing across the valley. Her heart clenched with fear. She knew that sound. Indians, Apache. Her knees gave way and she sank to the sand. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. Maybe it was better this way. The stories she had heard about the Apache were filled with terror. How they struck fast, left no survivors, and vanished into the hills. She was too weak to run. So she waited, her body trembling in the cooling air, her hands gripping the small revolver she had carried since her husband's death. It had 1 bullet left. That was all she needed. When the riders appeared over the ridge, the setting sun burned behind them, turning them into silhouettes of fire and shadow. They moved with purpose, silent and sure, the dust curling up behind their horses' hooves. She could see the feathers in their hair, the streaks of paint across their faces, the rifles slung across their backs. There were 6 of them. One rode slightly ahead of the rest, his bearing calm, his posture commanding. Even from a distance, she could tell he was the one they followed. Clara raised the gun, though her arm trembled too hard to aim. Her lips cracked as she whispered a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. Before she could pull the trigger, the lead rider lifted his hand. The group halted. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the lonely cry of a hawk circling above. Then he dismounted. He walked toward her slowly, his moccasins barely stirring the sand. His eyes, dark as nightfall, studied her with something she didn't expect. Curiosity, not cruelty. His face was strong, lined by sun and wind, his expression unreadable. She wanted to hate him, to fear him, but all she felt was an odd calm, as if her heart recognized something her mind couldn't yet name. When he stopped a few paces away, she lifted the revolver higher, though her hand shook uncontrollably. He didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke in a deep, measured voice, the words thick with accent but clear enough for her to understand. "You will not use that," he said quietly. "I will if I have to," she rasped. His gaze swept over her face, her trembling arms, the bruises at her wrist. Then, with a motion so quick she barely saw it, he reached forward and twisted the revolver from her hand. The sound of the hammer clicking empty rang between them. He looked down at it, then back at her. "1 bullet," he murmured. "You wanted to die?" She turned her face away, her throat tightening. "It's none of your concern." For a long moment he didn't move. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. There was no threat in his touch, only something fierce and ancient, something she couldn't name. "Everything that breathes has purpose," he said. "Even you." She tried to pull away, but her body was too weak. He turned and called out something in his own language. The other Apaches rode closer, surrounding her. She expected pain or cruelty, or the cold edge of a knife. Instead, they lifted her gently, almost carefully, placing her across one of the horses. She wanted to protest, but her strength was gone. The last thing she remembered before the darkness claimed her was the sound of the chief's voice. "Take her back," he said. "She belongs to me now." When Clara awoke, the air smelled of smoke and sage. She was lying inside a small wickiup made of brush and hides. Her body ached. Her throat was dry, but she was alive. She could hear the soft crackle of a fire outside, the low murmur of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Slowly, she pushed herself upright. Her dress had been cleaned, her wounds bandaged. Someone had cared enough to save her life. The thought unsettled her. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong anywhere. She crawled to the edge of the shelter and peered out. The Apache camp spread before her. Dozens of fires glowing beneath the darkening sky. Women cooking, children playing, men tending to their horses. She felt like an intruder in another world. And then she saw him again. The chief who had taken her gun, the one who had spared her life. He stood near the fire, speaking to an older warrior. Even in the dim light, he looked formidable, commanding without effort. Something about him made her uneasy. It wasn't just his power. It was the quiet certainty in his every movement, the way people looked at him with trust and respect. When his gaze turned and caught hers from across the camp, her heart skipped. He didn't speak, but there was something in his eyes that held her in place, something between a promise and a warning. That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of drums echoed faintly through the camp, rhythmic and deep, like the pulse of the earth. She thought of her husband, of the grave under the cottonwood tree, and of the life that had been taken from her. A part of her still wanted to die, but another part, small, buried, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. At dawn, the chief appeared at the entrance of her shelter. He held a small clay bowl of water and a strip of dried meat. She hesitated, but hunger won over fear. As she ate, he crouched nearby, watching her with the stillness of a man used to command. "You are far from your people," he said. "They're all gone." Her voice cracked. "You should have let me die." His expression didn't change. The spirits did not agree. She let out a shaky laugh. "Spirits? They've forgotten me a long time ago." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "They did not forget. They sent you to me." His words stirred something deep inside her. She didn't want to believe them, but there was conviction in his tone that made her chest tighten. "And what happens now?" she whispered. He straightened to his full height, the morning light glinting off the beads around his neck. "Now you live," he said simply, "among us. You will learn our ways. You will heal. And if I refuse?" He studied her quietly, then said, "You belong to me. The desert chose it. You can fight it, but you will not win." She stared at him, her pulse pounding. There was no threat in his voice, only truth, spoken like a man who never doubted the will of fate. When he turned and walked away, the wind stirred the ashes of the dying fire, and she sat frozen, torn between fear and something she couldn't yet name. For the first time in weeks, Clara didn't think about dying. She thought about surviving, and that frightened her even more. The days that followed felt like a blur between fear and confusion. Clara stayed mostly inside the small wickiup they had given her, too uncertain to step beyond its doorway. The Apache people moved around her with quiet grace, each person seeming to know their place and purpose. The women carried water from a nearby stream, their laughter light as they worked. The children chased each other through the dust, their bare feet leaving faint prints that the wind soon erased. The men trained with bows and horses, their movements sharp and precise. It was a life built from rhythm and respect, far removed from the noise and cruelty of the white settlements she had once known. The chief, whose name she learned was Taji, kept his distance most of the time. Yet his presence lingered, felt more than seen. Sometimes she caught him watching her from across the camp, his eyes unreadable. He didn't treat her as a prisoner, nor did he treat her as one of his own. She existed somewhere in between, a stranger the desert had carried into their lives. She didn't know if she was safe, or simply waiting for a fate she couldn't yet see. On the third morning, an older woman entered her shelter. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were warm. She carried a clay pot of water and a folded piece of deer hide. Without a word, she began to gesture for Clara to wash. Though they didn't share a language, the woman's patience and kindness softened something inside her. When Clara hesitated, the woman smiled gently and said, "Noya." She pointed to herself, repeating it once more. "Noya." Clara nodded slowly. "Clara," she said in return. Noya seemed pleased by the exchange. She helped Clara clean her wounds, braid her tangled hair, and change into a simple buckskin dress. It was softer than she expected, and though it felt strange against her skin, she couldn't deny the comfort it gave. When Noya finished, she placed a small carved pendant into Clara's palm, a bird with outstretched wings. "For protection," Noya said in broken English. "Spirits see you." Clara wanted to ask what that meant, but Noya had already risen and stepped outside. Later that day, the camp gathered near the river where several men were preparing for a hunt. The air buzzed with energy. Taji stood near the edge of the group, giving quiet instructions to his warriors. Clara stayed in the background, close enough to observe but far enough not to intrude. She noticed the respect the others had for him. They listened without question, their trust in him absolute. As she watched, a memory tugged at her, a flash of her husband's voice, his laughter, his hand resting over hers as they built their cabin together. He had believed so strongly that the frontier would give them freedom. Yet freedom had come with a price neither of them had been ready to pay. Clara swallowed hard, forcing the memory away. When Taji's gaze met hers from across the clearing, her stomach tightened. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet recognition. It was as if he could see the storm inside her without her saying a word. For reasons she couldn't explain, she turned away first. That evening, as the campfire crackled and shadows danced against the canyon walls, Noya brought her a bowl of stew and gestured for her to join the others. Clara hesitated but followed. The people sat close together, sharing food and laughter. Someone began to drum, the sound deep and rhythmic, and a group of women started singing softly. The melody rose and fell like wind through the pines, haunting, beautiful, and full of something ancient. She sat at the edge of the circle, unsure if she belonged there. Then Taji approached and sat beside her. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines of strength and weariness. "You still wish for death?" he asked quietly. Clara stared into the fire. "I don't know what I wish for anymore." He nodded slowly, as if her answer made sense. "The desert tests all who walk it. Some break, some are remade." She turned to look at him. "And which am I?" "That is not for me to say," he replied. "But you are still breathing. That means the test is not done." His words lingered in her mind long after he left. That night she dreamed of fire and rain, of a great bird soaring across the desert sky. When she awoke, the pendant Noya had given her seemed to glow faintly in the dawn light. As days turned into weeks, Clara began to learn small things about their way of life. She watched the women grind corn between smooth stones, weave blankets from goat hair, and care for the children with gentle hands. She learned how they read the land, the way they could tell by a bird's flight if a storm was near, or by the shape of a footprint, which animal had passed through. It was a world that moved with the rhythm of nature rather than against it, but not everyone accepted her presence easily. She often felt the weight of eyes on her back, the murmurs that followed when she passed. One young warrior, in particular, looked at her with open distrust. His name, she overheard, was Chaitan. He had lost family to settlers, and though he obeyed Taji, he made no effort to hide his resentment. Once, when she bent to draw water, she caught him muttering something under his breath, a sharp phrase that needed no translation. She pretended not to hear, but the sting of it followed her all day. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Taji approached her once more. He handed her a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. For healing, he said. She took it carefully. I don't understand why you keep helping me. You don't even know who I am. He studied her for a long moment before answering. I know what you carry inside. The eyes do not hide the spirit. You have lost something. I have seen that loss before. She wanted to ask what he meant, but he had already turned away. His calm unsettled her. He was unlike any man she had known, steady, but with a quiet power that drew people to him without demand. That night, while the camp slept, Clara sat by the dying fire, tracing the lines of the bird pendant with her thumb. The sound of distant coyotes filled the air. She thought about leaving, but where would she go? The desert would finish what fate had started, and something deep inside told her that walking away from Taji now would be a mistake she didn't yet understand. The next morning, she followed Noya to the river. As they worked, Noya began to hum the same haunting tune from the fire circle. Clara asked softly, "What does it mean?" Noya paused and touched her chest. "Song for the lost ones," she said. "For those who walk between worlds." Clara frowned. "Between worlds?" "You live, but your heart sleeps," Noya explained, tapping Clara's chest gently. "One day, spirit wake. Then you know who you are." Clara didn't answer, but the words stayed with her. That night, a storm rolled across the desert. Lightning flashed over the ridges and thunder shook the ground. The people moved quickly to secure their shelters, covering fires and tying down hides. Clara huddled inside her wickiup, clutching the pendant. The wind howled like something alive, rattling the branches overhead. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the entrance. Taji stepped inside, soaked from the rain. "You are safe?" he asked. She nodded, startled by his presence. "Yes." He glanced around, then crouched beside the fire pit. "When the storm comes, the spirits move close. They listen. You must stay calm." "I'm not afraid of storms," she said, her voice shaking only a little. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You should be. Storms change what they touch." Outside, the wind roared louder. The sound of something crashing echoed through the valley. For a moment, she thought she saw fire in the distance, a glow moving between the trees. Taji noticed it too. His eyes narrowed. "Riders," he murmured. "Riders," she repeated, fear tightening in her chest. He stood abruptly. "Stay here." Before she could respond, he was gone into the storm. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. The thought of men riding in the darkness, raiders, maybe soldiers, brought back too many memories. She crawled to the entrance, peering into the rain-soaked night. Flashes of lightning lit up the canyon, revealing figures moving fast across the plain. Gunfire cracked faintly in the distance. She felt her throat close. The same men who had destroyed her home? Or others like them? The possibility made her blood run cold. As thunder rolled overhead, she whispered a silent prayer, not for herself, but for the people who had taken her in. For the first time in a long while, she didn't want to see anyone else die. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Then came shouting. The camp stirred awake, chaos breaking through the rain. Clara stayed frozen, torn between fear and the strange pull that kept her waiting for Tazi to return. The fire outside hissed and died in the rain, leaving only darkness. And in that darkness, the world held its breath, caught between what had been and what was about to come. The storm raged across the valley like an angry spirit, tearing at the hides of the shelters and flooding the dry ground that had not seen rain in weeks. Clara crouched inside her wickiup, listening to the chaos outside. The thunder had grown louder, mixing with the shouts of men and the unmistakable crack of rifles. She pressed her hands over her ears, praying the fighting wouldn't reach her. But prayers felt fragile in a place like this. Through the slit in the doorway, she saw flashes of movement. Apache warriors on horseback, their faces painted, their cries sharp and fierce as they moved through the storm. Then came other figures, harder to see, firing from the cover of rocks and trees. The air filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Clara's chest tightened. She had seen this before. It was always the same, men fighting for land, for power, for survival, and it always ended in loss. A sudden burst of light illuminated the ridge, and she saw Taji astride his horse, shouting orders over the storm. He moved like part of the wind itself, unshaken, fearless, his voice cutting through the noise. For a moment, she forgot her fear, watching him command his people with calm precision. Then a shot rang out and she saw him stagger. Her heart stopped. Without thinking, she pushed out into the rain. The wind tore at her hair and the ground sucked at her boots, but she kept going, her vision blurring from the downpour. She stumbled through the mud, calling his name, though her voice was drowned by thunder. The camp had become chaos. Warriors rushing past her, women pulling children into shelter, flames flaring and dying in the wind. She found him near the fallen tree at the edge of the clearing. He was kneeling, gripping his shoulder, blood running dark against his skin. When he saw her, his eyes widened with something like disbelief. "You should not be here," he said through gritted teeth. "You're hurt," she said, dropping to her knees beside him. He shook his head sharply. "It is nothing. Go." But she didn't move. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her hands trembling. "You'll bleed out if you don't stop moving," she said. He didn't argue this time. The sounds of battle faded for a moment, replaced by the steady rhythm of the rain. Then, from the shadows of the ridge, a man's voice called out, a voice Clara recognized. It was sharp, familiar, and cruel. "Well, look what we've got here," the voice drawled. The runaway rancher's wife and her new friends. Clara froze. That voice belonged to one of the raiders who had destroyed her home. Taji looked up at her, reading the terror in her eyes. "You know them?" She nodded, barely able to speak. "They killed my husband." Taji's expression hardened. He rose slowly, despite the pain, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. Lightning flashed, revealing several men moving down the slope. Raiders armed with rifles, their faces twisted with greed. They weren't soldiers. Not really. Just scavengers drawn by the promise of stolen land and easy prey. The Apaches regrouped quickly, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Arrows flew through the storm, followed by gunfire. Clara ducked low, her heart pounding. She watched as one of the raiders fell. Another retreated. Taji moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a man wounded. When one of the attackers charged toward him, he met him head-on, striking with swift precision. By dawn, the raiders were gone, either dead or driven back into the desert. The storm had passed, leaving the camp drenched and silent. Smoke rose from the smoldering fires, mingling with the mist that crept along the ground. Clara sat by the river, her hands shaking as she tried to clean the blood from her arms. Taji stood nearby, speaking with Chaitin and the others, his face grim. When he finally approached her, she expected anger. Instead, he simply said, "You were brave." She shook her head. "I was foolish. I shouldn't have left the shelter." He looked at her for a long time. Foolishness and courage often walk together. She almost smiled but couldn't. The weight of what had happened pressed too heavy on her chest. "Those men, they followed me here, didn't they? If I hadn't come, your people wouldn't have been attacked." Taji's eyes softened. "The desert decides what comes. You cannot carry blame for the wind." But she did. Deep down, she knew it was true. The past she thought she had escaped had found her again. In the days that followed, the camp worked to rebuild what was lost. Clara helped where she could, though she often caught the villagers watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some whispered that she had brought bad spirits upon them. Chaitin's distrust deepened, his words sharp whenever she came near. "You see," he told Taji one night as they stood near the fire. "She brings danger. The white man's curse follows her. Send her away before it kills more of us." Clara overheard the argument from her shelter. She sat still, her stomach twisting with guilt. She didn't need to understand every word. They spoke with enough anger for her to know. But Taji's voice rose calm and steady. "She stays," he said. "The spirits have bound her to this place. Until her purpose is known, she remains. The camp quieted after that, though the tension lingered like smoke. One evening, Clara walked to the river alone. The air was cool and still, the water reflecting the pale light of the moon. She crouched by the edge, dipping her fingers into the current. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to cry. Not from fear or guilt, but from the strange sense that she was caught between two worlds, one she had lost and one that still refused to claim her. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the stones. She turned to see Chaitan watching her. His face was hard, but there was something else in his eyes. Pain, maybe even confusion. "You don't belong here," he said. "I know," she answered softly, "but I don't belong anywhere else either." He stared at her for a long moment. "Taji thinks the spirit sent you. I think the desert made a mistake." "Maybe it did," she said quietly. "But I didn't ask to live. He made that choice for me." Chaitan didn't reply. After a while, he turned and walked away, leaving her with only the whisper of the river and the wind rustling through the reeds. As the nights grew colder, the tension in the camp didn't fade. Scouts reported seeing riders again, men moving through the canyon, watching from the cliffs. It was clear the raiders hadn't given up. Taji began preparing his people for another fight, though he knew their numbers were small. Clara found herself helping Noya gather herbs and bandages, though her hands often trembled. She had spent her life running from danger, but now she felt something shift inside her. The thought of losing these people, of seeing them slaughtered like her husband, was unbearable. One night she found Taji sitting alone on a rise overlooking the valley. The moonlight washed his face in silver. She approached quietly and sat beside him. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked. "Even now, when you know I've brought danger?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the distant hills. "Long ago," he said finally, "a woman came to our people. She was not of our blood. She was lost, like you. My father saved her life. The tribe said she would bring ruin, but she brought peace. She taught us things we did not know, and she died protecting this land. The spirits remember her. When I saw you in the desert, I saw her spirit again." Clara listened, her throat tight. "And what if you're wrong?" "Then I will face whatever comes," he said simply. "But I do not think I am wrong." She turned to look at him, studying the lines of his face, the calm strength, the unshakable belief. It frightened her how much she wanted to trust him. In the distance, a wolf howled, and the sound rolled across the desert like a warning. The next morning, scouts returned with grim news. The raiders were gathering again, this time with more men. They planned to strike before the next full moon. Panic rippled through the camp. Women began packing supplies, ready to flee deeper into the mountains. Warriors sharpened their weapons, preparing for what they all knew might be the last stand. Taji called the people together at dusk. The fire burned bright, its light flickering across the faces of men, women, and children who had already lost too much. "These men bring fear," he said, "but fear does not live here. The land is ours. The river is ours. The spirits walk with us." His voice carried strength, but Clara could see the weariness in his eyes. When his gaze met hers, she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that the coming fight would decide everything. That night, as the camp fell silent, Clara lay awake, clutching the bird pendant in her hand. The world outside was too still, too quiet, like the desert was holding its breath. And in that stillness, one truth settled deep inside her. Death had chased her across the frontier, but this time she wasn't ready to meet it. Not yet. Not while these people still needed her. Not while the desert still whispered that her story wasn't finished. The days before the coming attack passed like a breath held too long. Every sunrise brought whispers of movement in the distance, signs of riders tracking the canyon trails. The air itself seemed restless, heavy with waiting. The people worked quietly, repairing weapons, storing food, gathering water. Clara moved among them, helping Noya prepare poultices and bandages, her hands stained green from herbs. Though no one said it aloud, everyone knew the storm was coming again. this time fiercer than before. Taji grew quieter, spending long hours alone near the ridge watching the horizon. His eyes had changed since the first attack. They were sharper, more distant, like he could already see the outcome of what was to come. Clara wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but every time she approached, words failed her. She knew what fear looked like. She had lived with it for months. But what he carried wasn't fear. It was burden. One night, as the wind swept through the canyon, Clara found him by the fire sharpening his knife. The glow lit his face, revealing lines of exhaustion beneath his calm. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't look up. "A chief rests when his people are safe." "They trust you," she said. "They'd follow you anywhere." He set the knife down and finally looked at her. "They will have to. The raiders are close. Maybe 2 days." Her chest tightened. "Then we should leave. Take the children, the women. Hide in the mountains." Taji shook his head. "They would find us. The desert knows no hiding from men like them. They would burn the land to ash to claim it." She stared into the fire, her heart pounding. "Then what will you do?" He hesitated, his voice lowering. "We fight, but not as they expect." She wanted to press him for details, but something in his expression stopped her. There was a secret plan forming behind his eyes, something dangerous. The next morning, scouts returned with news that the raiders had set up camp less than a half-day's ride away. They were waiting for dawn to strike. Panic rippled through the tribe, but Taji's steady voice calmed them. He told them where to move, where to build fires, how to draw their enemies into the narrow pass where numbers would not matter. Clara listened from the edge of the crowd, her stomach churning. Later, she helped Noya and the other women gather supplies for the wounded. They spoke little. Even the children were quiet that day. The silence was thicker than the desert air. When the sun began to fall, painting the sky red, Taji came to her shelter. "You will stay with Noya and the others by the river," he said. "Do not move until the fighting ends." "I can help," she said quickly. "I've seen what bullets do. I can treat wounds." He studied her, his gaze deep. "You have already done enough. You are not meant to carry more blood." Her throat tightened. "You can't fight them all, Taji." He smiled faintly. "No, but I can make them believe they face an army." She wanted to tell him how much his life mattered, how the camp would fall apart without him. But before she could speak, he placed his hand over her heart. "The spirits brought you to me for a reason. If I do not return, you must remember that." The words froze her. "Don't say that." He didn't answer. His hand lingered for a moment. Then he turned and walked away, his figure fading into the gathering dusk. That night, the camp was wrapped in shadows. Fires burned low to keep from being seen. The warriors moved like ghosts, checking weapons, whispering quiet prayers. Clara sat near the river with Noya, her stomach tight, her mind a storm of fear. The older woman sat beside her, calm as stone. "The desert tests the spirit," Noya said, "but remember, it never takes what it does not mean to return." Clara tried to take comfort in her words, but it felt hollow. Every sound in the night made her flinch. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a coyote, the faint hum of wind moving through the canyon. Somewhere out there, men were waiting with guns and hatred, and the people she had come to care for were walking straight toward them. When dawn came, it came cold and gray. The light crept slowly across the land, revealing the camp half empty. The warriors were gone. Only the women, children, and elders remained by the river, their faces pale with dread. Clara stood watching the horizon, her hands shaking as she clutched the small bird pendant against her chest. The first gunshot echoed through the valley, then another. The sound rolled like thunder, louder and closer until the entire canyon seemed to shake. Noya grabbed her arm. "Stay," she warned. "Do not go." But Clara couldn't. Something in her broke loose, and before she could stop herself, she was running, up the path that led to the ridge. The air was filled with dust and smoke, the scent of gunpowder burning her throat. She climbed higher, her breath ragged until she reached a ledge overlooking the pass. Below her, chaos unfolded. Taji and his warriors had drawn the raiders into the narrow gorge where the rocky walls closed in tight. The Apaches fought from above, striking fast and vanishing before the raiders could fire back. It was like watching the desert itself rise up to defend its own. But the raiders were many, their rifles flashing in the sunlight. For every one that fell, another took his place. Clara's heart pounded as she searched for Taji among the fighters. She saw him near the center, moving like a shadow through smoke and dust, rallying his men. He fought with precision and fury, every motion deliberate. But even from a distance, she could see he was tiring. Blood stained his arm again. The sound of hooves tore her attention to the right. More riders were coming through the far side of the canyon, reinforcements, twice as many as before. Her stomach dropped. The trap had worked, but now it would turn against them. She turned to run back, to warn someone, but a figure stepped out from behind the rocks, blocking her path. It was Chaitin. His face was hard, his eyes burning. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You have to tell Taji," she gasped. "More are coming." "I already know," he said, his voice low. He knew too. She stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" "He knew they would outnumber us," Chaitin said. This was never about winning, it was about time. He wanted the women and children to escape deeper into the mountains. That is the only way they live. Clara's mind reeled. Then he's going to die. Chaitin's jaw tightened. A chief's life is the price for his people's future. She shook her head violently. No, there has to be another way. But before he could answer, another explosion echoed through the valley. The sound made the ground tremble beneath them. Smoke billowed upward, and through the haze, she saw the ridge near the far side collapsing, rock and fire swallowing men on both sides. Chaitin grabbed her arm. "Go now." She resisted, her eyes locked on the chaos below. She could see Taji near the center waving his arm, signaling his warriors to retreat. But he didn't move with them. He stayed behind, covering their escape. Clara's heart broke open in that moment. Without thinking, she tore free from Chaitin's grip and ran down the slope. He shouted after her, but she didn't stop. Rocks tore at her feet. Smoke stung her eyes. But she kept going until the air was thick with gunfire and screams. She stumbled into the gorge just as the raiders surged forward. The ground was littered with the fallen, the air heavy with smoke. She saw Taji struggling to reload his rifle, his arm bleeding heavily. She ran to him, dropping beside him. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raw. "You told me the desert decides," she said, breathless. "Well, it decided I'm not leaving you." He looked at her, something fierce flickering behind his pain. "Then we stand together." Before either could say more, a bullet struck the rock behind them, shattering it into shards. Clara screamed as Taji pulled her down, shielding her with his body. He fired back, the sound deafening. Around them the battle raged on, closing in from every side. The Apaches were retreating up the ridge, and Clara could see Noya and the others leading the children into the mountains. But down here, the fight was far from over. Taji turned to her. "You must go with them." "I'm not leaving you." He caught her face in his hands, his eyes blazing with intensity. "You must. The spirits brought you here for a reason, but that reason is not to die in this place." Tears blurred her vision. "Then come with me." He hesitated, his gaze lifting toward the ridge where his people were escaping. "If I leave, they will be hunted. I stay, they live." Before she could argue, another gunshot rang out. The world seemed to explode around them. Dust and fire filled the air, drowning her in sound and light. When the smoke began to clear, she reached for him, her hands shaking. "Taji?" But all she could hear was the echo of the desert wind, carrying the cries of battle into the endless sky. The ridge above was burning, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and ash. She could still see movement, shadows fighting, falling, but Taji was nowhere in sight. She tried to rise, but her legs gave out. The ground beneath her was trembling, the canyon groaning under the weight of destruction. Somewhere behind her, the river roared louder than before, breaking through its banks. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, clutching the pendant that had once felt like protection. Now it felt like a promise. Above her, thunder rolled once more, not from the storm but from the battle reaching its breaking point. The desert seemed alive again, holding its breath as everything she cared for balanced on the edge between life and death.